The rain poured down hard as Lee stood across the street from Bellini's, one of those fancy restaurants where a single meal costs more than what he had in his pockets right now. Absolutely nothing. His stomach growled for the third time in as many minutes, reminding him that he hadn't eaten anything but half a stale bagel since yesterday morning. 2 months ago, his life had been completely different. Back then, people paid hundreds of dollars to watch him play piano in concert halls. Back then, his refrigerator was always full, and he lived in an apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city park. Back then, his name appeared in music magazines and on posters. Now, at 34, he was just another hungry man in a rain-soaked coat, his fingers, still long and graceful despite everything, clutching the handle of a battered suitcase. Inside that suitcase were the only things he couldn't bear to sell: his favorite sheet music and a photograph of his grandmother sitting at her old, upright piano, teaching 5-year-old Lee to play his first notes. One day at a time, he whispered to himself, the mantra that had kept him going since everything fell apart. The scandal had been swift and brutal. A jealous fellow pianist named Wei had accused him of stealing compositions, of being a fraud. By the time the truth came out and Wei's lies were exposed, the damage was already done. No concert hall would book him. No music school would hire him. His reputation lay in tatters, and his savings had quickly disappeared, paying for a lawyer to clear his name. Lightning flashed, illuminating Bellini's golden interior through the large front windows. That's when Lee spotted it. A grand piano in the corner of the restaurant, its polished black surface gleaming under the chandeliers. He hadn't touched a piano in weeks. His fingers twitched at the sight of it. The hostess gave him a suspicious look when he pushed through the front doors, dripping water onto the marble floor. He knew what she saw. A soaking wet man in clothes that had seen better days, certainly not their usual clientele. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cool, one hand reaching for the phone, probably ready to call security. "I'd like to speak with the manager." "Please," Lee said, trying to keep his voice steady. Dignified. "Regarding?" Lee hesitated. "The piano." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she disappeared into the back and returned moments later, with a tall man in an expensive suit. "I'm the owner. Paolo Rossi. What's this about my piano?" The man's eyes narrowed, taking in Lee's disheveled appearance. Lee swallowed his pride. "Sir, I haven't eaten in almost 2 days. I was wondering, could I play your piano in exchange for a meal? Just something simple from the kitchen?" Paolo snorted, and a few diners at nearby tables turned to stare. "You want to play for food?" he asked loudly enough for others to hear. A couple of business people at the bar smirked into their martinis. Lee nodded, his cheeks burning with humiliation. "And what makes you think you can play well enough to entertain my guests?" "I was trained at the National Conservatory," Lee said quietly. "I've played professionally for 15 years. Is that so?" Paolo looked amused now, glancing toward his patrons as if sharing a private joke. "Well, folks, looks like we have a concert pianist among us. Shall we let him audition for his supper?" Several people laughed. A woman in a red dress whispered something to her date, and they both chuckled. Paolo turned back to Lee. "All right, piano man. You have 10 minutes. If my customers enjoy it, you get dinner. If not..." He shrugged and pointed toward the door. Lee nodded and followed Paolo to the piano corner. The instrument was even more beautiful up close. A Steinway Model D, the kind he used to play at international competitions. His heart raced at the sight of it. 10 minutes, Paolo repeated, tapping his watch. As Lee set his wet suitcase down and removed his dripping coat, he could feel eyes on him, some curious, most dismissive. A waiter walked by, deliberately giving him a wide berth. At the closest table, an older couple looked uncomfortable, as if worried he might ask them for money next. Lee sat down on the bench, and something shifted inside him. His back straightened automatically, shoulders relaxing into a familiar posture. He placed his hands on the keys. They were cold from the rain, but it didn't matter. This was home. This was the one place in the world where he still knew exactly who he was. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. What should he play? Something flashy to impress them quickly? Something popular they might recognize? No. If this was to be his only meal today, if this was to be his first time touching a piano after weeks of silence, he would play what his heart needed. His fingers began to dance across the keys, gentle at first, then building in intensity as he launched into Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. It was widely considered one of the most technically challenging pieces ever written for piano, but to Lee it had always felt like an old friend, demanding but rewarding, complex yet intimate. The first few notes alone transformed him. Gone was the hungry man begging for food. In his place sat the artist who had once received a 7-minute standing ovation at Lincoln Center. His body swayed slightly as his hands stretched to reach impossible chords, his fingers a blur across black and white keys. The restaurant grew quieter. Lee didn't notice, lost in the music, his eyes still closed. He didn't see the waiter stop mid-stride, tray of drinks temporarily forgotten. He didn't see Paolo's smirk fade into an expression of disbelief. He didn't see the woman in the red dress set down her fork and turn fully toward the piano corner, her conversation abandoned. As he moved from the first movement into the second, Lee poured everything into the music, his hunger, his shame, his rage at how quickly people had turned on him, his grief for the career that had defined his life. The piano responded to his touch as if it had been waiting just for him, the notes ringing clear and true through the restaurant. A memory surfaced as he played, his grandmother saying, "Music is the last honest thing in this world. You can lie with words, you can lie with your face, but you cannot lie with music. It always tells the truth about who you are inside." Tonight his truth was complicated, a mixture of desperation and defiance, of hunger and hope, and the music reflected all of it. The melancholy of the slower passages giving way to thunderous, passionate sections where his hands became a whirlwind across the keyboard. He had lost track of time completely when he finally brought the piece to its powerful conclusion, the final notes lingering in the air like a question left unanswered. Only when the last sound faded did he open his eyes. The restaurant was utterly silent. Every single person was staring at him. Had he failed? Was the music too intense, too complex for a dinner setting? Would they ask him to leave now? Then someone near the back began to applaud. Others joined in, and suddenly the entire restaurant erupted in applause and cheers. People rose to their feet, napkins still on laps, drinks forgotten in hands. Paolo stood nearest to the piano, his expression unreadable. When the applause finally died down, he approached Lee slowly. 15 years professionally, you said. His voice was different now, respectful, perhaps even a little awed. Lee nodded, suddenly exhausted. The music had taken everything from him. "Who are you?" Paolo asked. "Really?" "My name is Lee Song," he answered quietly. "I was the youngest winner of the international Chopin competition before." He trailed off, not wanting to explain the scandal, the false accusations, the swift and merciless fall from grace. Understanding seemed to dawn on Paolo's face. "I remember reading about you. That other pianist, the one who accused you, he admitted to lying, didn't he?" Lee nodded, surprised the man knew about it. "Yes, but by then the damage was done," Paolo finished for him. A waiter appeared at Paolo's side, leaning in to whisper something. Paolo listened, then turned back to Lee with a strange smile. "It seems my customers have a request." He gestured toward the dining room, where people were still watching intently. "They'd like to know if you would consider playing through dinner. Not just for your meal," he looked almost embarrassed now, "but as our paid entertainment for the evening." Before Lee could answer, the waiter spoke up. "There's something else, sir. Mr. Blackwood is here." Paolo's eyes widened. "Richard Blackwood? The symphony director?" The waiter nodded. "Table 12. He's asking to speak with the pianist when he's finished." For the first time in months, Lee felt something like hope flutter in his chest, fragile as a paper bird. "But definitely there, I think," Paolo said slowly. "That your luck might be changing, Mr. Song." He extended his hand. "But first you need to eat. Playing like that takes energy, and from the looks of it, you haven't had much food lately." As Lee shook the man's hand, he couldn't help but think of how quickly things had changed, how 10 minutes at a piano had transformed him from a beggar to a maestro in their eyes. "Can I play for food?" They had smirked. Now they knew. Paolo led Lee to a table near the kitchen, away from the main dining area but with a clear view of the piano. "Eat first," he insisted, handing Lee a menu. "Then play again. My chef will prepare whatever you want." Despite his hunger, Lee found it hard to focus on the menu. His eyes kept drifting to the man sitting at table 12. Richard Blackwood, director of the City Symphony Orchestra, one of the most respected musical institutions in the country. The same Richard Blackwood who had once offered Lee a position as a featured soloist before the scandal B. "Just bring me whatever's quickest," Lee told the waiter, his stomach too tight with anticipation to feel hunger anymore. "Something simple." The waiter nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. Paolo lingered at the table, looking awkward. "I owe you an apology," he finally said. "The way I treated you when you first came in, it wasn't right." Lee shook his head. "You didn't know me." "That's no excuse for treating another human being that way," Paolo replied. He hesitated, then added, "My father was a musician too back in Italy. A violinist. He always said you could tell a person's entire life story by the way they play." Paolo glanced toward the piano. "You're playing. There's something in it I've never heard before. Pain, yes, but something else too." Before Lee could respond, the waiter returned with a steaming bowl of pasta and a basket of bread. The rich smell of garlic and butter made Lee's mouth water, reminding him just how long it had been since his last real meal. "Eat," Paolo said gently. "Take your time, then play whatever you want for as long as you want." He gestured toward the dining room. "They'll wait," and wait they did. As Lee ate, slowly at first, then with increasing appetite, he noticed something unusual. No one was leaving. Even tables that had finished their meals were ordering coffee, dessert, after-dinner drinks, all while casting expectant glances toward the piano corner. A couple who appeared to be on a first date were talking animatedly, the woman gesturing toward Lee with excitement. An elderly gentleman was showing something on his phone to his companions, probably looking up Lee's past performances, he realized. Most disconcerting of all, Richard Blackwood sat alone, drinking a glass of red wine, his eyes occasionally meeting Lee's before looking away. When Lee finally finished eating, the best meal he'd had in months, Paolo reappeared at his side. "Ready?" Lee nodded, wiping his mouth with a napkin and standing up. The restaurant seemed even more crowded now, with people standing near the bar and a few unfamiliar faces that hadn't been there during dinner. Word had spread. As Lee made his way back to the piano, a hushed expectation fell over the room. He sat down, flexing his fingers, warm now and strengthened by food, and considered what to play next. The Rachmaninoff had been a declaration of his technical skill, but now he wanted to show something different, something more personal. He began to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, a piece that started deceptively simply before building into one of the most emotionally complex works ever written for piano. Under his fingers, the opening notes hung in the air like a story about to be told. Lee lost himself in the music again, but this time with a different awareness. Not the desperate hunger of before, but something more like coming home after a long absence. His body remembered this, the way the piece built from tender reflection to passionate outbursts. He swayed slightly as the music flowed through him, each phrase leading naturally to the next. Halfway through, he glanced up and noticed a woman standing near the doorway, watching him with intense focus. Something about her seemed familiar, though he couldn't place her. Tall and striking in a simple black dress with silver streaks in her dark hair, she carried herself with the unmistakable posture of a musician. As the piece reached its thunderous conclusion, Lee felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the pure joy of making music without fear or shame or doubt. For these few minutes, the scandal didn't exist. The poverty and hunger didn't exist. There was only the music, the piano, and the room full of people sharing in something beautiful. The applause that followed was even more enthusiastic than before. People stood, some wiping tears from their eyes. The woman in the doorway remained still, watching him with an unreadable expression. Lee played for another hour. Debussy's dreamy Clair de Lune, Beethoven's stormy Appassionata Sonata, even a playful improvisational piece based on a popular song that had several younger diners grinning in recognition. With each piece he felt more of his old self returning, the musician who lived to connect with audiences through sound. Finally, Lee played a piece his grandmother had taught him, a folk melody from her childhood village. Simple and haunting, it required no technical fireworks, just pure emotional honesty. As the last note faded, he kept his hand hovering over the keys, reluctant to break the spell. When he finally looked up, Richard Blackwood was standing next to the piano. "Lee's song," he said, his voice deep and thoughtful. "I thought I might never hear you play again." Lee's mouth felt dry. "Mr. Blackwood, I was at your last concert before the accusations," Blackwood interrupted. At Davis Hall, you played the Emperor Concerto. Lee nodded, remembering that night all too well, the last time he'd performed professionally before Wei's accusations had destroyed everything. You were technically flawless then, Blackwood continued. Perfect in every way. Lee tensed, waiting for criticism. But tonight... Blackwood's eyes had an intensity that made Lee uncomfortable. Tonight you played better. Better? Lee asked, confused. I missed notes in the Rachmaninoff. The Beethoven wasn't as clean as... Music isn't about being clean, Blackwood cut in. Any conservatory graduate can play the notes. What you did tonight... He gestured around at the restaurant where people were still watching their interaction closely. You made these people feel something. That's much rarer than technical perfection. Before Lee could respond, the woman he'd noticed earlier approached. Up close, he finally recognized her. Jin Park, founder of the prestigious Park Music Academy, one of the most exclusive music schools in the city. Mr. Song, she said, extending her hand. Your playing was extraordinary, Ms. Park, Lee acknowledged, shaking her hand, his mind racing. Jin Park rarely attended concerts, let alone showed up at random restaurants. I've been following the unfortunate events of your career with interest, she said bluntly. When Wei confessed to fabricating those accusations, I expected you would return to performing. It's not that simple, Lee replied. The damage was done. Yes, she nodded. The music world can be unforgiving, but it also recognizes true talent. She glanced at the piano, then back to Lee. My academy's piano instructor left unexpectedly last week. The position is open. Lee stared at her, unable to process what she seemed to be suggesting. You're offering me a job, he finally asked. I'm offering you an interview, Jin corrected. Though after tonight's performance, it would be a mere formality. Blackwood cleared his throat. Actually, I have a proposition as well. He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to Lee. Our soloist for next month's gala suffered a hand injury yesterday. We need a replacement for the Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 3. His eyes held Lee's steadily. The piece you played when you walked in. Lee looked down at the card, then back up at the two musical giants standing before him, offering second chances he'd stopped believing were possible. I don't understand, he said quietly. Why would you take a risk on me after everything that happened? Jin's expression softened slightly. Because talent like yours doesn't appear often. Mr. Song, it would be a tragedy to lose it because one jealous man told lies. And because, Blackwood added, the music you played tonight wasn't just technically brilliant. It was honest. There's hunger in your playing now and pain and something else that wasn't there before. Resilience, Jin suggested. Humanity, Blackwood countered. Whatever it is, it transforms the music. Paolo appeared with Lee's old coat and suitcase, now dried by the kitchen's heat. Your things, maestro, he said with a new respect in his voice. And this, Paolo added, handing Lee an envelope. From the customers. They took up a collection. Lee started to object, but Paolo raised a hand to stop him. It's not charity. They paid for a private concert from Lee Song. Many are asking if you might come back and play again. Looking around, Lee realized the restaurant had mostly emptied while he'd been talking with Blackwood and Jin. Only a few tables remained occupied, their occupants casting admiring glances his way. I don't know what to say, Lee admitted. Clutching the envelope, the business card, his shabby suitcase with its precious contents. Say you'll consider both our offers, Jin replied with a small smile. We can discuss details tomorrow. For tonight, I believe Paolo has offered you a room upstairs for the night? Lee looked questioningly at Paolo, who nodded. The restaurant owns 2 guest rooms for special visitors. It would be my honor. For the first time in months, Lee wouldn't have to worry about finding a shelter bed or sleeping in a train station. For the first time since the scandal, he had possibilities, connections, a way forward. Thank you, he said, the words entirely inadequate for the emotions swirling within him. All of you. As Lee followed Paolo toward the stairs at the back of the restaurant, he caught sight of his reflection in a mirror behind the bar. He barely recognized himself, not because of the worn clothes or the too thin face, but because of the expression in his eyes. Hope, from the humiliation of can I play for food, to job offers from the most prestigious institutions in the city, all in a single evening. The thought was too overwhelming to fully process. Tomorrow would bring decisions, plans, the beginning of rebuilding a shattered career. But tonight, With a full stomach and the feel of the piano keys still tingling in his fingers, Lee allowed himself to believe that second chances were possible after all. Lee woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment, panic gripped him. Where was he? Then the events of the previous night came flooding back. The desperate request to play for food. The performances that had silenced the restaurant. The unexpected meetings with Richard Blackwood and Jin Park. The guest room above Bellini's was small but comfortable, with a view of the busy street below. Lee sat up and noticed his clothes, freshly washed and pressed, hanging on the closet door. Someone had taken them while he slept. On the nightstand sat a tray with coffee, orange juice, and a note from Paolo. "Breakfast downstairs when you're ready. Take your time." As Lee showered and dressed, he kept expecting to wake up from this dream. Just yesterday morning, he'd been counting coins to see if he had enough for a cup of coffee. Now 2 prestigious job offers awaited his decision, and he'd slept in a clean, warm bed for the first time in weeks. The envelope of cash from last night's impromptu concert sat on the desk. He'd counted it before sleeping, still in disbelief. $347 in tips from restaurant patrons. Enough to rent a cheap room for a week, to buy decent clothes for interviews, to breathe. Downstairs, Paolo greeted him with a warm smile. "Our celebrity. Come sit. My chef is making you a special breakfast." The restaurant was quiet at this hour, not yet open for lunch. A few staff members were setting tables, and they nodded respectfully as Lee passed. Yesterday, they'd seen a homeless man begging to play for food. Today, they saw the celebrated pianist whose story had probably been explained to them by Paolo. How quickly perceptions change, Lee thought. "Did you sleep well?" Paolo asked, pouring Lee a fresh cup of coffee. "Better than I have in months," Lee admitted. "Thank you for everything." Paolo waved away the thanks. "After what you gave my customers last night, I should be thanking you. My phone has been ringing all morning. People asking if the pianist will be playing again tonight." Before Lee could respond, the chef emerged with a plate of eggs, toast and fruit, setting it down with a flourish. "For the maestro," he said with a wink. As Lee ate, Paolo sat across from him. "So what will you do? The Park Academy or the Symphony Orchestra?" Lee set down his fork, considering. "I'm not sure I'm ready for either." Paolo looked surprised. "But these are incredible opportunities." "Yes," Lee agreed. "And 3 days ago I was sleeping on a park bench. It's a lot to process." The restaurant door opened and Jin Park walked in, looking just as elegant in daylight as she had last night. "I hope I'm not interrupting breakfast," she said, approaching their table. "Not at all," Paolo replied, standing to pull out a chair for her. "Coffee?" "Please," she nodded, then turned to Lee. "I wanted to speak with you before your meeting with Richard Blackwood." Lee blinked. "We have a meeting?" "At 11, Jin confirmed. He called me this morning. We both want to talk with you about possibilities." "Both of you?" Lee was confused. "Together?" Jin smiled slightly. "The music world is small, Mr. Song. Richard and I have known each other for decades. When we realized we were both interested in your talents, we thought a joint conversation might be more productive than competing for you." Paolo quietly excused himself, leaving them alone at the table. "Ms. Park," Lee began, "I appreciate your interest, but I need to be honest. I'm not the same pianist I was before the scandal. I don't know if I can be what either of you needs." Jin studied him for a moment. "That's precisely why we're interested, Mr. Song. The pianist you were before was technically brilliant, but somewhat safe. What we heard last night was something entirely different." Lee stared at his coffee. "Desperation doesn't seem like a sustainable artistic quality." "It's not the desperation," Jin replied. "It's what the experience has given you. Depth, vulnerability, a connection to the music that comes only from having lost everything and found your way back to it." She leaned forward. "Do you know how rare that is? How many technically perfect pianists come through conservatories every year, and how few of them actually move people?" Before Lee could answer, his phone buzzed, an unfamiliar sound after weeks of keeping it turned off to save the battery. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Saw you play last night. Incredible. We need to talk." "Wei." Lee's hand tightened around the phone. Wei. The man whose lies had destroyed his career, his reputation, his life. The man who had finally admitted the truth months later, when the damage was already irreversible. "Is everything all right?" Jin asked, noticing his expression. Lee hesitated, then showed her the message. Jin's face darkened. You don't owe him anything. I know, Lee said, putting the phone away without responding. But eventually I'll have to face him. On your terms, Jin emphasized. When you're ready, Lee nodded, grateful for her understanding. About your offer. And Mr. Blackwood's. I'd like to hear more, but I need to be realistic about where I am right now. Of course, Jin said. That's why we're meeting at 11. No pressure, just a conversation about possibilities. She stood up. The Academy's car will pick you up at 10:30 if that works for you. After Jin left, Lee finished his breakfast in a daze. 24 hours had transformed his life beyond recognition, and he wasn't sure he trusted any of it yet. Homelessness had taught him how quickly good fortune could vanish. He decided to go for a walk to clear his head. The morning air was crisp, the streets filling with people rushing to work. No one gave him a second glance now, just another person going about his day. The invisibility felt different from yesterday's. Then people had looked away from his poverty. Today they simply didn't notice him at all. Without meaning to, Lee found himself walking toward Central Park, where the city's Symphony Hall stood. He stopped across the street, gazing up at the grand building where he'd performed so many times before. The place where just 6 months ago, he'd received a standing ovation for his performance of Beethoven's Emperor Concerto, his last professional appearance before Wei's accusations. On the Symphony Hall's facade hung a huge banner. Annual Gala Concert next month. Below it, in smaller letters, featuring Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, the concerto he'd played last night, the piece Blackwood wanted him to perform. It's a sign, you know. Lee turned to find an old man standing beside him, also looking up at the banner. Excuse me? The old man gestured toward the Symphony Hall. I said it's a sign. You standing here looking up at that? He tilted his head. You're a musician, aren't you? I can always tell. Lee nodded, wondering how this stranger could possibly know. Something in the way you stand, the old man explained, as if reading Lee's thoughts. The way you listen, even to traffic. Musicians hear the world differently. He pointed toward the hall again. You played there before? Yeah, Lee admitted. The old man studied him. But not recently. No. You will again, the old man stated with surprising conviction. Lee smiled sadly. It's complicated. Music always is, the old man agreed. That's why it matters. He glanced at his watch. Well, good luck to you, young man. Whatever path you're walking. As the old man shuffled away, Lee checked his own watch. 10:15 already. He needed to head back to Bellini's to meet Jin's car. When he arrived, Paolo was waiting with a garment bag. A loan, he explained, handing it to Lee. For your meeting. My son's suit, he's about your size. You can return it any time. Lee started to protest, but Paolo shook his head firmly. First impressions matter. Even second ones. The suit fit reasonably well. A simple dark blue that looked professional without being flashy. When Lee emerged from the bathroom after changing, Paolo nodded approvingly. Much better. Now you look the part. I'm not sure what part I'm playing anymore, Lee admitted. Paolo clapped him on the shoulder. The part of a man getting a second chance. It's a good role. I played it myself once. A sleek black car pulled up outside. Your chariot, Paolo said with a smile. The drive to Jin Park's academy took only 15 minutes, but it transported Lee to another world. Located in a converted mansion on a tree-lined street, the Park Music Academy exuded quiet prestige. As the car pulled through the gates, Lee saw students carrying instrument cases across the manicured grounds. Young musicians at the start of their careers, full of hope and ambition, unaware of how quickly it could all disappear. Jin was waiting in the entrance hall, talking with Richard Blackwood. They both turned as Lee approached, and something in their expressions, respect, curiosity, anticipation, made him stand a little straighter. Mr. Song, Jin said warmly. Right on time. Shall we talk in my office? As they walked through the academy's hallways, Lee heard music from practice rooms. A violin struggling through a difficult passage. A cello singing low and resonant. A flute trilling like a bird. The familiar sounds made his heart ache with longing. Jin's office was unexpectedly simple. No grand desk or imposing furniture. Just comfortable chairs around a coffee table near a window overlooking a garden. A baby grand piano stood in the corner. Please sit, she invited, gesturing to the chairs. Tea? As Jin prepared the tea, Blackwood turned to Lee. "Have you had a chance to think about our offers?" "I have," Lee nodded. "And I'm grateful. But I need to understand exactly what either of you would expect." Jin returned with the tea. "Fair enough. Let me be clear about what I'm proposing. A position teaching advanced piano students 3 days per week. You'd have your own studio here, a decent salary, and most importantly, time to rebuild your performance career. And my offer," Blackwood added, "is the solo spot in next month's gala, with the possibility of more engagements if that goes well. The symphony would promote your return heavily. We both know your story would draw attention." Lee took a deep breath. "And neither of you is concerned about the scandal? About Wei's accusations?" Jin and Blackwood exchanged glances. "The truth came out," Jin said simply. Wei admitted he lied. "But my reputation will be restored," Blackwood interrupted, "as soon as people hear you play again." He leaned forward. "What happened to you was unjust, Lee. The music world failed you. Let us help make it right." The sincerity in their faces was almost too much to bear. After months of closed doors and unanswered calls, here were two of the most influential people in classical music, offering him a way back. "I need time to think," Lee finally said. "Of course." Jin nodded. "But not too much time. We have students who need a teacher, and Richard has a gala to prepare for." She smiled gently. "How about this? Come back tomorrow. Play for our students. See how it feels to be in a teaching environment again. And come to symphony rehearsal afterward," Blackwood added. "Just to listen. No pressure." As they talked about logistics, Lee found himself staring at the piano in the corner of Jin's office. His fingers itched to touch the keys to see if last night's magic had been real, or merely a product of desperation. Jin noticed his glance. "Would you like to try it?" Without waiting for an answer, she stood and lifted the piano's lid. It was my mother's. Not as grand as a concert Steinway, but it has soul. Lee hesitated only a moment before joining her at the piano. He sat down, placed his hands on the keys, and began to play. Not a classical piece this time, but a simple improvisation, notes flowing from some deep place inside him. As he played, Lee realized something important. Whether he chose the academy, the symphony, or both, music had found him again. Or perhaps he had found his way back to music. Either way, the path forward was suddenly clear. The notes he played formed a question and an answer all at once, filling Jin's office with possibility. The next morning, Lee found himself standing before 20 pairs of curious eyes in one of the Park Music Academy's teaching studios. Jin had arranged for him to give a master class to the advanced students. A test run, she called it, though Lee suspected it was as much for his benefit as for the academy's. "This is Mr. Song," Jin introduced him to the students. "Some of you may have heard of him before. He's considering joining our faculty." A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Lee caught fragments, famous pianist, that scandal, thought he disappeared, and felt his confidence wavering. These young musicians knew his story, or pieces of it. What would they think of learning from someone whose career had crashed so spectacularly? "I'll leave you to it," Jin said with an encouraging nod, slipping out of the room. Lee cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd spoken to a group. "Good morning," he began, his voice slightly rough. "Today I thought we could talk about... What could he possibly teach them? Technique? Theory?" These students had regular access to some of the best instructors in the country. A girl in the front row, she couldn't be more than 16, raised her hand. "Sir, are you really the Lee Song who won the International Chopin competition?" Lee nodded. "Could you play for us first?" she asked. "Before the lesson?" The request sent a wave of relief through him. This, at least, he could do. He sat at the studio's grand piano, took a deep breath, and began to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Not a technically demanding piece, but one that required emotional sensitivity. As the gentle, dreamy notes filled the room, Lee watched the students' faces. Some closed their eyes, some watched his hands intently, and one boy in the back seemed to be holding back tears. When Lee finished, the room remained silent for several heartbeats before erupting in applause. "That was beautiful," the girl who had asked him to play said softly. "Thank you," Lee replied. Then, on impulse, he asked, "What did you hear in that performance?" The students looked confused. "I mean," Lee clarified, "not the notes, but what did you feel?" What story did the music tell you? Slowly, hands began to rise. A boy with glasses said. It sounded like remembering something beautiful that you've lost. A girl with braids added. There was longing in it. Like homesickness. The boy in the back who had seemed emotional finally spoke up. It was honest. Not like when our teachers play to show off technique. Lee felt something click into place. That's what I want to talk about today. Not how to play the notes perfectly. Your regular teachers already show you that. I want to talk about how to make your audience feel something real. For the next 2 hours, Lee listened to students play, but instead of the usual technical corrections, he asked questions. What were you thinking about during that passage? Who are you playing for? What do you want us to feel right now? The approach seemed to unlock something in the young musicians. A boy who had played a Beethoven sonata mechanically found new energy when Lee asked him to imagine playing it for someone he missed. A girl struggling with a difficult Liszt piece relaxed and played it beautifully when Lee suggested she focus on the story she wanted to tell, rather than hitting every note perfectly. By the end of the class, the atmosphere had transformed from polite attention to electric engagement. When Jin returned, she found the students crowded around the piano, Lee demonstrating a passage to a rapt audience. It seems to be going well, she observed as the students reluctantly gathered their things and headed to their next classes. They're incredibly talented, Lee said, watching them leave, and hungry for something beyond technical perfection. Jin nodded. That's why we need you, Lee. Many teachers can show them how to play correctly. Few can show them how to play meaningfully. The girl with braids lingered, clutching her sheet music. Mr. Song, will you be our teacher from now on? Lee looked at Jin, then back at the girl. I'm still deciding. Please say yes, the girl said earnestly. Nobody's ever asked me how the music feels before. After she left, Jin turned to Lee with a knowing smile. She speaks for all of them. I enjoyed it more than I expected, Lee admitted. Teaching, I mean. It's different from performing, but complementary, Jin added. Many great performers teach. It keeps them connected to why they fell in love with music in the first place. She checked her watch. Richard's rehearsal starts in 30 minutes. Ready for part 2 of your day? The symphony hall felt both familiar and alien as Lee followed Richard Blackwood through the stage door. How many times had he walked this same path to rehearsals and performances? Yet today he entered as an observer, not a performer. The orchestra was warming up, the familiar chaotic blend of scales and snippets of the day's repertoire. Several musicians nodded to Richard as he led Lee to seats in the center of the empty hall. We're working on the Rachmaninoff today, Richard explained. The piano part will be played by our rehearsal pianist, but I wanted you to hear the orchestra to remind yourself what it feels like. Lee nodded, suddenly nervous. The last time he'd heard this piece in this hall, he'd been the soloist with a different orchestra on tour. Now he would listen as someone else played the part Richard was offering him. The rehearsal began, the orchestra launching into the brooding opening of Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto. When the piano entered, Lee found himself tensing. The rehearsal pianist was technically proficient, hitting all the right notes at the right times, but something was missing: the fire, the hunger that the piece demanded. Richard must have noticed Lee's expression. He's just our staff pianist, he whispered. Good for rehearsals, but... No, he's fine, Lee replied automatically, the polite response of a professional musician. Richard gave him a knowing look. We both know fine isn't what this piece needs. They listened through the first movement, Lee's fingers unconsciously moving on his knees, playing along with passages he knew by heart. When the movement ended, Richard excused himself to give notes to the orchestra, leaving Lee alone with his thoughts. The symphony hall looked different from this perspective. From the stage, he had seen only the first few rows clearly, the rest of the audience a blur of shadowy figures. From here, he could see every detail of the stage where he'd once stood triumphant, where he might stand again if he accepted Richard's offer. His phone buzzed, another text from Wei. Please. Just 15 minutes. I need to apologize in person. Lee stared at the message, conflicting emotions churning inside him. Part of him never wanted to see Wei again. Another part needed closure, needed to hear why someone he'd considered a colleague had deliberately tried to destroy him. He typed a quick reply. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., the coffee shop on 4th. Almost immediately, Wei responded, Thank you. Richard returned, settling back into his seat as the orchestra prepared to continue. "Second movement," he announced, then glanced at Lee. "Everything okay?" Lee nodded, putting his phone away. "Just making plans for tomorrow." "Oh? Anything important?" "I'm meeting Wei," Lee said quietly. Richard's eyebrows shot up. "Are you sure that's wise?" "Probably not," Lee admitted, "but necessary." The second movement began, the melancholy theme winding its way through the orchestra. As Lee listened, he realized something. Just 2 days ago, he'd been at rock bottom playing piano for a meal. Now he had job offers, students who wanted to learn from him, and the chance to return to the concert stage. It felt too good to be true, too fragile to trust. After the rehearsal, Richard walked Lee to the stage door. "What did you think?" "The orchestra sounds wonderful," Lee said honestly. "And the piano part?" Lee hesitated. "It was—" "Exactly." Richard nodded, understanding what Lee left unsaid. "That's why we need you." He paused, then added, "I know Jin made her offer this morning. I won't pressure you, but I hope you'll consider mine as well. The gala is in 3 weeks. We'd need to start rehearsing next week." "It's not that I don't want to," Lee began. "You're afraid," Richard stated matter-of-factly, "of failing, of being judged, of putting yourself out there again after everything that happened." Lee couldn't deny it. "Fear is natural," Richard continued. "But ask yourself this. When you were playing at that restaurant 2 nights ago begging for a meal, were you afraid then?" "I was desperate then," Lee countered. "And that desperation freed you," Richard said. "You played without fear because you had nothing left to lose." He placed a hand on Lee's shoulder. "You still have that freedom, Lee, even though circumstances have changed. You've already survived the worst that could happen." The words hit home with unexpected force. Lee had lost everything, his career, his home, his reputation. Yet he'd survived and somehow found his way back to music. What was there left to fear? "Think about it," Richard said gently. "Talk to Jin. Visit Wei. But don't let fear make your decision for you." That evening, Lee returned to Bellini's, where Paolo had insisted he stay until he found a permanent place. The restaurant was busy, the dinner rush in full swing. As Lee slipped through the dining room toward the stairs, several patrons recognized him, nudging their companions and pointing. "There he is," Paolo called out, hurrying over. "Our resident maestro. Will you play for us again tonight?" The question caught Lee off guard. After a day of teaching and listening to Rachmaninoff, he felt mentally exhausted. Yet something in Paolo's hopeful expression, and in the expectant faces of the diners, made it impossible to refuse. "Just 1 or 2 pieces," Lee agreed. As he made his way to the piano, removing his jacket and rolling up his sleeves, Lee thought about the day's experiences. The students who had responded so powerfully to his approach to teaching. The orchestra playing the concerto he knew so well. Richard's words about freedom and fear. He sat at the piano, flexed his fingers, and began to play. Not classical this time, but a jazz standard his grandmother had loved, Autumn Leaves. The familiar melody took on new life under his fingers, wistful yet warm. As he played, Lee looked around the restaurant where his fortunes had changed so dramatically. Paolo was watching from near the bar, a proud smile on his face. The diners had fallen silent, meals temporarily forgotten. 2 nights ago, Lee had asked, "Can I play for food?" Now people were willing to pay to hear him. 2 prestigious institutions wanted his talent. Students responded to his teaching. A closed door had reopened. Yet as his fingers danced across the keys, improvising around the melody, Lee realized something important. Whether he played for a restaurant full of diners, for academy students, or for a concert hall audience, the music itself remained the same. His relationship to it was what had changed. He had found his way back not to where he had been before, but to somewhere new, somewhere perhaps he was always meant to be. Tomorrow would bring a difficult conversation with Wei. After that, decisions would need to be made about Jin's and Richard's offers. But tonight there was just this moment, these notes, this audience, and for now, that was enough. The coffee shop on 4th Street was nearly empty at 9:45 the next morning. Lee chose a table in the back corner facing the door. His hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, more for something to hold than because he wanted to drink it. His stomach was too tight with anxiety. 5 minutes later, the bell above the door jingled and Wei walked in. Lee hadn't seen his former colleague in nearly 7 months. Wei looked thinner, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. Dark circles shadowed his eyes as he scanned the cafe, then froze when he spotted Lee. For a moment, Wei just stood there, as if unsure he would be welcome. Then, gathering his courage, he approached the table. "Thank you for meeting me," he said quietly, not quite meeting Lee's eyes. Lee gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit." Wei sat, placing his hands flat on the table, then withdrawing them to his lap, then back on the table again. His nervousness was palpable. "Would you like coffee?" Lee asked, more to break the uncomfortable silence than anything else. Wei shook his head. "I don't deserve your politeness." Lee studied the man who had destroyed his career with a few carefully planted lies. There had been a time when he'd fantasized about this moment, about confronting Wei, screaming at him, demanding to know why. But now, seeing how broken Wei looked, Lee felt only a dull ache where his rage had once burned. "Why did you want to meet?" Lee finally asked. Wei took a deep breath. "To apologize. To explain, if you'll let me. Not that any explanation could justify what I did." Lee waited, saying nothing. "I saw you play at Bellini's 2 nights ago," Wei continued. "I was there with clients. I've been giving private lessons since everything happened. I didn't know you would be there. When you walked in, I almost left, but then you started playing and—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "And?" Lee prompted. "And it was the most beautiful playing I've ever heard," Wei said softly. "So much more than before. Before, you were technically perfect. Now you're something else entirely." Lee felt a flash of irritation. "I didn't come here to be flattered." "No, of course not," Wei said quickly. Seeing you there playing for food, knowing it was my fault." His voice cracked. "I've been trying to contact you ever since. To tell you how sorry I am. It's not enough, I know, but I need to say it anyway." "Why did you do it?" Lee asked, the question that had haunted him for months. "We weren't even direct competitors. There was room for both of us." Wei looked down at the table. "It wasn't about competition. It was about jealousy. Not of your success, of your gift." He looked up, his eyes wet with tears. "You play from somewhere I can't reach, Lee. You always have, even at the conservatory. I practiced 8-10 hours a day. You practiced half that and played twice as beautifully. So you tried to destroy me because I had natural talent?" Lee asked incredulously. "No," Wei shook his head. "Because you had soul. Because audiences felt something when you played that they never felt when I played. Because no matter how perfectly I performed, it was never what you gave them." He wiped his eyes. "It was wrong. Unforgivable, I know that." Lee sat back, taken aback by the raw honesty. He had expected excuses, deflections, perhaps even a continuation of the lies. Not this naked admission of envy and inadequacy. "I lost everything," Lee said quietly. "My career, my apartment, my savings. Do you understand that?" Wei nodded miserably. "After I confessed, no one would hire me either. I lost my position at the conservatory. My reputation was ruined. As it should be," he added quickly. "I deserved it. You didn't." They sat in silence for a moment, 2 fallen pianists in a nearly empty coffee shop. "I heard the Park Academy has offered you a position," Wei finally said. "And the symphony wants you for the gala." Lee raised an eyebrow. "News travels fast. Like Richard said, the music world is small," Wei replied. "Are you going to accept?" "I haven't decided." "You should," Wei said with unexpected firmness. "What I heard at Bellini's, the world needs to hear that, Lee. What I did was terrible, but if it somehow led you to play with that kind of truth—" He shook his head. "Maybe something good can come from my mistake." Lee considered the man across from him. Once a colleague, then an enemy, now something more complex. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," he said honestly. "I understand," Wei nodded. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know how sorry I am. And—" He hesitated, then reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. "I wanted to give you this." Lee took the folder and opened it. Inside was sheet music, a piano piece he didn't recognize. "What is this?" "Something I composed," Wei said. "For you. A small way to begin making amends, perhaps. It's called Redemption." Lee stared at the notes on the page. The piece looked challenging but beautiful, with complex emotional shifts and a hopeful resolution. "You don't have to play it," Wei added quickly. "It's just an offering. Before Lee could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Richard Blackwood. Decision time. The orchestra needs to know today. Almost simultaneously, another text arrived from Jin. Students asking if you'll be their new teacher. Need your answer by this afternoon. The moment of decision had arrived. Lee looked at Wei, at the composition he'd written, at the text demanding answers. Everything converged in this moment: his past, his possible futures, the hurt he'd experienced, and the healing that had begun. I need to go, Lee said, standing and gathering the sheet music. Wei nodded, also rising. Of course. Thank you for meeting me. It's more than I deserved. As they walked to the door, Wei paused. Whatever you decide, Lee, please don't stop playing. Not for me, but for everyone who needs to hear what you have to say through music. Outside the cafe, they parted ways. Wei turning left, Lee right. But something had shifted. The weight of anger Lee had carried for months felt lighter somehow. Not gone, but transformed into something he could set down when he was ready. Lee walked to a small park and sat on a bench, the morning sun warm on his face. He called Jin first. I've been thinking about your offer, he began. And? Jin prompted when he paused. I want to teach at the academy, Lee said, the decision feeling right as he spoke it. But only 3 days a week, as we discussed. I need time for other commitments. Wonderful. Jin's delight was evident even through the phone. The students will be thrilled. When can you start? Next week, Lee replied. There's something else I need to do first. After ending the call with Jin, he immediately called Richard. I was hoping you'd call, Richard said by way of greeting. What's your decision? I'll play the Rachmaninoff at the gala, Lee told him. On one condition. Name it. I'd like to add a short piece to the program. A new composition, something that's never been performed before. There was a pause, then Richard asked, Something of yours? No, Lee said. Something by Wei. The silence on the other end lasted so long that Lee wondered if the call had dropped. You want to perform a piece composed by the man who destroyed your career? Richard finally asked, disbelief evident in his voice. Yes, Lee confirmed. It's called Redemption. It's his apology in the only language that truly matters to either of us. Another long pause. This is unexpected. Music is about truth, isn't it? Lee asked. That's what you and Jin both said you heard in my playing now. This is part of my truth, the journey from where I was to where I am. Send me the score, Richard said eventually. If it's good enough, we'll add it to the program. A world premiere. 3 weeks later, Lee stood backstage at the Symphony Hall adjusting his bow tie. The gala was sold out, the buzz around his return to the concert stage having spread throughout the music world. Critics, former colleagues, students from the academy, even Paolo and his restaurant staff, all were in the audience, and in the back row, Lee knew sat Wei, the conductor of the evening. Richard appeared at his side. Ready? Lee nodded. Ready. As they walked onto the stage, the audience erupted in applause, warm, welcoming, curious. Lee bowed, then settled at the piano as Richard raised his baton to begin the Rachmaninoff. The familiar opening orchestral passage washed over him, and then it was time for the piano to enter. Lee's fingers found the keys, no longer cold and desperate as they had been at Bellini's, but still carrying the memory of that night, of playing for food, of rediscovering what music truly meant to him. He played not as the old Lee would have, technically flawless but emotionally safe, but as the new Lee, shaped by loss, hunger, humiliation, and ultimately resilience. Each note carried the truth of his journey. When the final movement reached its thunderous conclusion, the audience leapt to their feet, applause shaking the hall. After 5 curtain calls, Richard raised his hands for silence. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special addition to our program tonight. The world premiere of a new work, Redemption, composed by Wei Lin, performed by Lee Song. A murmur ran through the audience. Those who knew the history between the two pianists exchanged shocked glances. As the hall quieted, Lee placed his hands on the keys once more. The piece began softly, tentatively, like a question asked in the dark. Gradually it built in complexity and confidence, moving through passages of doubt and struggle before finding its way to a resolution that was neither simple nor complete, but hopeful. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of profound silence before the applause began. Thoughtful at first, then building to an ovation as powerful as the one that had followed the Rachmaninoff. Looking out at the audience, Lee caught sight of Jin in the third row, nodding in approval. Paolo stood nearby, beaming with pride. And at the back of the hall, Wei remained seated, his head bowed. Redemption, Lee realized, was not a single moment, but a process for him, for Wei, for anyone who had lost their way and was finding it again. It happened not in grand gestures, but in small choices. The choice to play for food when hungry, the choice to teach with honesty, the choice to perform a piece written by someone who had once hurt him deeply. As he took his final bow of the evening, Lee knew that tomorrow he would wake up and teach his students at the academy. The day after, he would play at Bellini's, honoring the place where his journey had turned. And the day after that, he would continue forward, note by note, choice by choice, into whatever music awaited him next. The question, "Can I play for food?" had led him here, to a new understanding of himself as both artist and human, to a place where hunger had taught him how to truly feed others through his music. And for that lesson, despite everything, he was grateful.